Hello, this is Will Schleck from IronCrow AI, and today I'm going to be doing not a new feature demo, but more of a tutorial on how to use the LLM Sandbox to respond to a 102 rejection. Uh, Basically, the prototypical prior art rejection that you can get in an office action. So I thought I'd do a more hands-on how to use this tool to do something that patent practitioners need to do pretty regularly. So to get started, we are in the new Unified Sandbox tab. And in our context, we have all the files related to this office action. And these are files that you would automatically have populated if you are a OA Shell subscriber. OA Shell can send the files related to an office action directly into the LLM sandbox, which speeds things up, but you can also just upload these files yourself. But basically, we have an office action, the originally filed application, and then two cited references of Levkova and Omron. And in addition to those kind of standard set of files, I've added some preferred office action response style examples, and I'll show you how we use those a little bit later. But to get started, I'm going to enter this prompt to just orient ourselves to what's happening in this office action. So please summarize each substantive issue or rejection in the provided office action, and I will select just the file of interest. So this example is going to illustrate one example strategy for how to use this tool to respond to a 102 rejection. There's obviously other styles, other approaches and strategies that can be used, but this is going to be kind of the default strategy that I've used to good effect. And one of the keys is to select just the files that are relevant for your query to kind of pull out information from each of those documents. So it's similar to what you would do if you were responding to an office action without any of these tools. You would start by reviewing the office action itself. So we'll start there. So now we've got our summary. It includes a few different things. There's some 103 rejections, there's a 102 and a 101. We're just going to focus on the 102 rejection for simplicity. So we can see the claims that it pertains to, the references that were used. It's an anticipation rejection, obviously, and it uses this Omron reference. So that's a good start. Let's ask to provide a more detailed summary of this 102 rejection. So let's kind of zoom in on what's happening with the 102 rejection specifically. And we're going to keep this office action file as our only context file because that has all the information relevant to this particular query. So really, the approach that you use, reviewing the office action, reviewing your application, coming up, comparing the application with the cited references, and then coming up with amendment ideas. Those are all things that can be done manually. And the strategy is basically the same, but with this tool, you're able to implement that strategy much, much quicker. So we can see, basically, it's giving us a mapping of the claim limitations and then how what part of Omron is being used to reject that limitation. So basically, there's a control system per vehicle comprising one or more controllers. That's basically taught in the abstract. Receive user movement data indicative of the movement of a user's head. Cool. So a claim mapping table basically showing the way that the examiner is mapping Omron onto the limitations of our claim. And then the examiner indicates Omron discloses each and every element. Yeah. Okay. So let's proceed and let's go ahead and have this tool recite claim one from the subject application and then give the subject application as our context file. This will just kind of bring to the surface the kind of most important independent claim, and we can then proceed to come up with amendment ideas and arguments to overcome the 102 rejection of claim one from there. So there we go. We've got claim one. Basically, it's a control system that determines uh, how much attention the user is giving to a non-driving task based off of movement data that's indicative of an object that's associated with a non-driving task, think like a cell phone or something, and it determines one or more relative movement parameters. So between the user's head and the object. So if your head is following your phone, you're probably paying attention to your phone. I think that's kind of what this claim is saying in a nutshell. So now we've got that. So let's go ahead and ask our next prompt. So we've provided the full originally filed patent application, and then we would like this tool to provide a detailed summary of the patent application to kind of contextualize the limitations of claim one. So we still got our application, and we're basically asking it to um, contextualize this claim in light of our full application. Again, this is something that you would probably do as a practitioner, implementing a normal pen and paper approach to responding to a 102 rejection. You'd look at the claims that are rejected, but then you would need to contextualize what do those limitations really imply? What are the potential amendments that we can make to those limitations based off of the support that we have in our original specification? So it's going to summarize this originally filed application, the core invention. We can read these, and I think in practice, this process would take a little bit longer. You would thoroughly read the responses, and then that would inform kind of your next prompt, your next move in this process. But for the sake of brevity for this demo, I'm going to basically not spend too much time with each of these responses. It's more about showing you a general approach to get the tool to pull out helpful information from relevant documents, to then give that tool the information it needs to synthesize claim amendments and a full response. So one thing I will draw your attention to is the movement analysis is one of the key features that it has identified. So it's the way that this system tracks movement along multiple axes and can determine different types of non-driving tasks and uses orientation-based motion sensors. So it's keying in on some of those limitations as being important for kind of the core technical meat of this application. So I'm going to say, perfect. I would now like you to provide a detailed summary of this main reference Omron. So let's go ahead and select the Omron reference as our only piece of context. And in your summary, pay particular attention to aspects of the reference which are relied upon in the rejection of claim one. So we're trying to find potential errors with the examiner's mapping or distinctions between Omron and our originally filed application. So go ahead and run that prompt. So it's really a step-by-step process, and you can do this in different ways. You could compare and contrast the originally filed application with Omron in a single prompt, but I kind of like to do things piece by piece. This is just an approach that I find works well. Just as a note, you can always use the agent mode to do multiple steps. So basically, I have a little prompt recipe that I'm drawing from. I'm copying and pasting those prompts into the dialog boxes here. But actually, I could kind of give it the full script and select agent mode and then have it kind of run from there and do each of these back and forth steps to kind of arrive at a final output. That doesn't work as well as doing it yourself, especially in light of the fact that your human intelligence, which has a much broader perspective, a much more holistic understanding of what your client needs and, how the world works, that's gonna be super helpful and inform some of the decisions that you make. So running a kind of a simple script or a simple single strategy for responding to any type of rejection is probably not going to give you the best results, but that is an option. You can use the agent mode to basically execute a sequence of steps automatically and output a response to a rejection. But I think this is a slightly slower but better approach. So we've now got a summary of our main reference, the Omron reference, critical differences, object movement focus, attention level determination, how the movement parameters are analyzed. So going into nice detail about where the possible distinctions are. So what I'm gonna say is that that's a good initial analysis, and I would now like you to review our originally filed application once more to further bolster or adjust these potential arguments or amendments. So the potential amendment strategy it has is to emphasize the analysis of correlation and time delay between head and object movements. So that's a really nice, specific technical distinction. It's a specific technical implementation whereby the relative head movement and object movement is actually being quantified to determine this relative movement parameters. And that's a distinction from Omron, and that's what this tool has identified. So I'm going to say, okay, good initial analysis, but now let's go back to our originally filed application to just double check that that amendment has support in our application. And this is the same thing that I do when responding to an office action. I'll come up with a hypothesis or a guess or a first assessment of what I think a good effective response strategy would be. But then I need to kind of iteratively go back to our application, the originally filed application, make sure we have literal support for those amendments, and then also double check that the reference doesn't anticipate or make obvious those amendments. Because the first reading of the reference, you probably weren't thinking of that particular amendment. You were just reading it to contextualize yourself to the case. So this iterative process normally takes a ton of eye strain. If you're a human, you have to read all of these things manually. But these tools basically give you a reading superpower. You can read all these documents in a matter of seconds, looking for specific pieces of information. And I think that's really the key way that you can use these tools to be an accelerator of your amendment and OA response strategy. So there we go. We've got some stronger differentiation points from Omron. It's going to look at the specific movement parameter analysis. It finds specific paragraphs that support these amendment ideas and argument ideas, time varying attention analysis, and then it will actually give incorrect markup notation some of the potential amendments. So wherein determining the one or more relative movement parameters comprises calculating a cross correlation between head movement and object movement as a function of time, leg displacement. That's a really great amendment, actually. I really like that. And it's nice that it's in this markdown notation, so you can actually see where that change has been made. So that's looking really good. You can continue this kind of iterative process, and I'll do one more round of this just to illustrate the point. So that's great. Now I want you to review the Omron reference once more. So yeah, now that we've got even more fleshed out amendment ideas and argument strategies, I'm going to have it look at the anticipatory reference one more time just to further kind of bolster or adjust its arguments or amendments as needed. I don't think that that's actually necessary in this case, but the point I'm trying to make is that even if you are a super smart patent attorney, it's very rare that you can kind of one-shot a correct amendment and response strategy. You probably have to kind of iterate, come up with a hypothesis or some amendment ideas, and then kind of iterate on those by looking at the references a few times and making sure that you have, support from the documents themselves. Um, and that you didn't miss anything on your first reading. So there we go, kind of an additionally refined strategy. So I'm going to stop there and not keep iterating. I think that's plenty good. So I'm going to say that's great. Now I would like you to select the strongest arguments amendments, which retain the broadest claim scope possible while ensuring a reasonable probability of overcoming the current 102 rejection. And then based on our entire conversation, to make those assessments. What's our strongest argument? And then if you require any additional information, let us know. So that's good. For context, we can just sure give it these three documents and run that. So the office action, our application, and Amra, those are the really only three documents that are necessary for this 102 rejection. And this is, it's a little bit silly that I'm asking the tool to decide what the best strategy is. I think this is a place where you would decide what the best amendment is, kind of giving your own human input as to any adjustments you'd want to see with these claim amendments. But in this case, I'm going to let the tool do that decision itself. So then it's got a recommended claim strategy. It's going into pretty good detail on how the relative movement parameters are actually determined. You know, you might want to tweak this. You might want this to be a little bit more abstract, a little bit less detailed, but I think this is fine. I don't personally like the list approach that's using one and two, so I might ask you to change that. But just for the sake of this demo, I'm just gonna say that that's fine and to proceed. Um, so I'll say that that looks great. Now I would like you to use this approach to respond to the 102 rejection of Claim 1, noting that we have made our suggested amendment. So this proposed amendment, we're kind of saying we're going to go ahead with that amendment, and then please format your response to match the structure and writing style of the provided office action responses. So that's what these preferred style, OA style examples are. I'm just giving it examples of previous OA responses that I've drafted, which I want it to put its response into that format. You can also use the style uh, tab here as well. But in this case, since we are in the interrogation mode, I'm gonna just select these here. And let's run that. And yeah, so there are different ways of kind of controlling the format of the output of this tool. And one of those is you can give an example of the format that you want in the context, and then just tell it explicitly, this is an example of a writing style that I like or a structure that I like. Please, mimic this. Or you can upload things to the style tab itself, and that will also work. So here we go. This is a complete uh, away response essentially for this rejection anyway. So it's saying here's a draft response. So rejections, it's got a section header for the 102 rejections. It's then listing that rejection and the reference, and then going ahead and saying that the applicant traverses this rejection. And then in order for a single prior art reference to anticipate a claim, it needs to teach each and every element, citing the MPEP. Then saying independent claim one is hereby amended, as hereby amended, is directed to a control system for a vehicle and recites the following feature. So it's saying, okay, we've gone ahead and made this amendment, and here's the amendment, and argues that, where does the support for this amendment come from in the application? And then why does this amendment overcome the cited reference of Omron? And then, going on in contrast, Omron merely discloses the system. Yeah, so highlighting the distinctions and then listing the actual citations of where in that reference those distinctions are kind of factually supported. And yeah, because Omron does not teach each and every feature recited in independent claim one, applicant submits that the 102A1, 102A2 rejection of claim one and its dependent claims should be withdrawn. Yeah, so I mean, this is basically following the style of response that I tend to make. This language might be different if you upload your own responses, but that looks great. And in order to finalize this, you can basically just copy paste. So you can double click on this chat bubble and then paste with keeping the source formatting. And then there you go. You've got a Times New Roman OA response to the 102 rejection, and it even includes the markdown notation for the claim amendment. You can make any little additional formatting changes that you want in this Word document. That's one way of responding to a 102 rejection, basically going from the files to the actual response and claim amendments themselves. We also have a Word add-in, so you could have done all of that from the Word add-in itself, which is just, one step closer to the actual Word document. Um, but everything works, equally well from the browser. So that's one example of uh, a general approach for how to respond to an office action, particularly a 102 rejection, using the LLM Sandbox. Basically, you start by summarizing everything that's going on with that rejection or with that office action. You zoom in on one of the rejections that you want to respond to. Usually rejections are, I would call it like linearly separable. They can be handled one by one. It doesn't really affect the other rejections. Like a 101 rejection has not really any bearing on a 103 rejection. So you can kind of break that office action into these different um, substantive issues that need to be addressed, zoom in on one of those substantive issues, and then iteratively examine the facts, which are basically the documents relevant to that rejection, adding your own insight and strategy through the conversation history, and then finalizing by providing some of your preferred work product examples to then, cast the strategy and thought and analysis that has been conducted through the chat history into that work product that matches the example of previous work product you have produced, and then, finally putting that into a Word document. So that is this example. That's this kind of hands-on example for how to do a 102 rejection. So thank you for your time, and I'll talk to you again later.